This was like a silent revolution.
Colorado is so often really at the center of national trends.
Colorado was the center of the disability rights movement in the 1970s and 80s. With the founding of ADAPT, a new era of activism among people with disabilities.
It became a national movement. Its heartbeat was coming from Denver.
Armed with the promise of equal access and the right leadership at the right time, 19 brave individuals inspired the nation. It was a long and challenging battle, blessed with the perfect mix of civil disobedience, the lens of the media, legal action, and passionate individuals whose lives depended on it.
The Gang of 19 are a group of young people that grew up in a Denver nursing home.
The protests in Denver were the beginning of a new era.
Denver became one of the first cities to have accessible mass transit.
And I don't know of any movement that was so insistent on winning.
Having their rights acknowledged and their abilities, rather than just their disability, was very important.
And so the ADA was passed to end a protest that began with the Gang of 19.
This program was generously made possible by the History Colorado State Historical Fund,
supporting projects throughout the state to preserve, protect, and interpret Colorado's architectural and archaeological treasures. History Colorado State Historical Fund. Create the future, honor the past.
with support from the Denver Public Library, History Colorado, and the Colorado Office of Film, Television, and Media, with additional support from these fine organizations. And viewers like you, thank you.
Humanity has always had, either by birth or accident, individuals that live with disabilities. Today in the United States, their rights are legally assured, but that was not always the case. Over 15 years before the Americans with Disabilities Act passed at the federal level in 1990, activists in Colorado were fighting for social change. Fueled by the civil rights movements that were sweeping the nation, Denver became ground zero.
44 million Americans at that time were disabled. You can't not know somebody who's disabled.
And so the activism of the 1970s in Denver has many dimensions, including very material change about the conditions under which people live, but also just a kind of good morning wake-up call to say this is a very big subject, and to every person to remember disability is not something that happens to other people. It happens to everyone in the aging process. We are all in the category of the temporarily able-bodied.
The beginnings of the disability rights movement really takes place after World War II and reaches a peak in the 1970s and 80s. And the Americans with Disabilities Act is just a little over 25 years old now.
And so there were important leaders doing important things everywhere. But the impulse for the movement, at least through the ADA, came through Atlantis Adapt.
For hundreds, if not thousands of years, people with disabilities were the objects of pity and derision, of discrimination. They were institutionalized, they were marginalized, they were segregated, they were treated as abnormal, they were put on exhibit in circuses and freak shows. People with disabilities in many cases were not considered human beings.
This is a cold and grim way of putting it, but it was sort of storage. We'll just store them. And if it requires sedation, if it requires confinement, that's what we'll do.
Before the ADA, people with disabilities would have been more isolated, not being able to have a job, not because they couldn't, but simply because society looked at it as someone with a disability couldn't work. They wouldn't have been able to go to school, or they would have had to go to a segregated special school.
The whole structure of healthcare has always been nationally funded. You couldn't go anywhere, you couldn't do anything. You were literally stuck because you couldn't move.
And before our movement began, you are guaranteed a nursing home bed to rot and die. You are not promised the right to home and community-based services and being able to live in those freedoms that we talk about. Just because you are born with or you acquire a disability, that doesn't give them a right to say, oh, we'll lock you up in a nursing home.
They would have been forced to live in institutions, particularly children who were born with a disability. Parents were encouraged at birth to send their children to institutions.
It was a very structured environment with lots of regulations to control the activity, control the behavior of the residents, of what they would have called the inmates at the time, because there wasn't a lot of difference between institutionalized homes for the disabled and prisons in many respects.
Or they would have been overly medicated, what's often called chemical restraints.
Haldol that was used to snow people and to keep them, snowing is the term that we use, to make people groggy and not alert. And snowing was the soup du jour for how to care for people, not just for agitation or behaviors, but as a way of tamping down the need to require anything or complain.
Roosevelt was elected in 1932. It tells you a lot about our attitudes towards people with disabilities that the President of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt, who had a disability, also tried to hide that disability from most Americans because he knew that even though he was a role model for others, being confined to a wheelchair was in his time a stigma. It was a confinement in a way that the Gang of 19 completely rejected.
And transportation at that time was extremely primitive. There was one or two private companies that provided wheelchair accessible transportation. They charged $35 for a ride, it doesn't matter, to and from. And at that time, if you were in a nursing home, the state gave you $10 a month in personal needs. So transportation became a big issue. People could not get on a bus, obviously. It was not wheelchair accessible, let alone getting into, a building, restaurant, and the like. So it was difficult. Children with disabilities were not guaranteed a free, appropriate education until 1973.
Actually, I'm old enough that I can tell you what it was like.
As of the tender age of 3, Dawn Russell spent a decade living in and out of Crippled Children's Hospital, a youth nursing home in Tennessee. Her actively engaged parents visited every time they were allowed, Thursdays and Sundays from 2 to 4 p.m.
The school that I went to wasn't accessible. The elementary wasn't accessible, so I was literally carried in to my school every day. It was absolutely growth stunning. I have cerebral palsy, and so without accommodations, without being able to get into the school, having to be carried into a classroom every day. Growing up and learning and all of those things are complicated. You have the other kids that you're contending with, and before I met ADAPT, I thought there were 2 types of people with disabilities, and I didn't want to be either one. The 2 types are super gimps and invalids. My whole life, I kept saying, I don't fit in that world. When I imagined my life, it had everything in it that everyone else does. Education, love, a home, a family. I may have been discriminated against, but I didn't sit there and take it. I fought it.
There were a bunch of young people housed in a nursing home called Heritage House, and it was a hellhole. Like, one person was amputated from repeated untreated bed sores at above the waist and was described as the shortest person in Colorado.
The reported neglect included residents with maggots in their wounds and flies on their face.
Cockroaches in cereal, people who were neglected, people who were abandoned by their families to institutions because of a variety of care reasons or the difficulty of caring for them in a non-accessible social order. Wade Blank came and was made the activities director.
Wade Blank was raised in Ohio, and over time in the 1960s he became a Presbyterian minister. He was a civil rights activist. He marched with Martin Luther King at Selma.
That was a major part of his story, and he was thoroughly trained in nonviolent civil disobedience.
He helped draft resistors during the Vietnam era. He was a man who believed in social justice.
He'd been a minister when Kent State people got murdered, and he had left Kent State after the killings and was basically horrified and not well emotionally. And he just needed to get out of everything. So he came here and he took this job as the activities director at Heritage House. It turned out that he led a movement out of there.
And in 1971, Heritage House was really organized along the lines of other disability institutions at the time. As Wade Blank pointed out, they were joyless places.
And my wife, then wife, said, there's this guy that works here, you'd really like him. We both had a background in civil rights. We hit it off. We became very close friends, and eventually Wade wanted me to work with him. And I realized the day I started that no one in this wing, and it accommodated about 60 people, really wanted to be there, but there weren't the community-based services.
At Heritage House, Wade Blank was placed in charge of youth services, and so he was catering to the needs of teenagers and people in their early 20s. Youth culture was really flourishing in the 1970s, and so the young people who lived at Heritage House wanted the same kinds of social activities and leisure activities that young people all over the country wanted. And Wade Blank did what he could to accommodate them. He would arrange for buses to take them to rock concerts. He allowed pets. He allowed all kinds of socialization, posters, anything for young people to express who they were as individuals.
It was 1974. We were pushing for more, quote, normalization. We had wine with meals for those that were of age. We oftentimes got pizzas. I don't know how we did it, but there were dogs. A lot of the people living there wanted dogs, and we were able to get them. We never let the health department know. It was very cool. Field trips left and right. We were involved with registering everyone to vote. We had some political candidates coming to the nursing home. Dick Lamb, Gary Hart, Tim Worth. I was in my late 20s. Wade was in his early 30s. We were getting a lot of pressure from the nursing home because we were pushing for more rights, that people should have a choice in who their attendant should be. Nurses were barging into rooms, when they should knock first. But he says, I think we need to get people out, and I have this idea, and I think it should be called Atlantis, lost city of great people. So it's like people in this nursing home behind, in institutions were lost. They were segregated from society. Wade was extremely funny. He could be very silly.
He liked rock and roll music a lot. He liked to fix things. He liked to make things happen. I think he was the best leader I've ever met. He had long blonde hair.
But apart from a few that were blessed with knowing Wade, he was extremely serious. He had a premonition that he was going to die young. You say, Wade, you're crazy. You're not going to die young, And he wanted to accomplish much in his perceived shortened life.
He was a great father. He loved his children, and he dragged them into everything.
And his wife was attracted to him, among other things, because he was such a great advocate.
One of the Heritage House residents who Wade worked with was Michael Patrick Smith, an ailing 21-year-old with muscular dystrophy.
Well, everyone liked Mike Smith. He was very philosophical. He knew he was going to die. He wrote poetry. He was one of the first people to move out of the nursing home when Atlantis became a reality.
And in those days, 21 was a full lifetime. And Michael was in the Denver General supposed to die, but didn't. He calls and he says, they're stealing my money. I said, they're stealing your money? I said, what kind of money do you have? He says, well, I get $25 every month for candy. It's called personal needs money. And they had forged his personal needs check by putting an X on the back while he was at Denver General. So I said, well, that can't be right. It turned out they'd done it to everyone. They'd stolen all their personal needs money. I said, so what else is bothering you? He said, well, I'm a poet. I can't use my hands to write, and I have all these poems, and they won't write them down. And I was not happy to hear that. And then he had some sexual abuse story about a nurse that was just sort of sexually taunting him. I said, okay, so let's sue them.
Blank began working with young people to place them outside of the institution in their own apartments. And he encouraged caregivers who worked at Heritage House to check in at the house and then go out to the apartments to provide their services. That plan didn't go over well with the administration at Heritage House.
He took a bunch of disabled people to the state legislature to protest the conditions that I didn't even touch the iceberg on. The lawsuit I filed against Heritage House was for 41 people, and each one of them had a horror story. So they fired him for doing that. The Heritage House fired Wade.
Not having a job was the impetus Reverend Wade Blank and his co-founder Barry Rosenberg needed to make the vision for Atlantis community more than just a grand idea. In 1975, he convinced the state to fund 8 units at the Sun Valley Las Casitas housing project.
Wade literally went to the state and said, here, give us a bunch of money so we can move people, deinstitutionalize people from a nursing home where they're being abused, because I made him testify and explain how awful it was. And pretty soon we were just literally infiltrating that building and interviewing everybody. And then he rescued them all, and that's the birth of the Atlantis community and the first action of the disability rights movement, if you think about it. Because the first movement, and it stayed the same theme, deinstitutionalize.
Wade and I were not administrative types. We were community organizers and activists. So we stumbled somehow through this all. And no organization I've ever been with could stretch $1 more than Atlantis. We had volunteers, whatever we had to do to get the program going. There were 15 people. The need was much greater, but that's all we had was 8 apartments. Most of them came from that one particular nursing home, Heritage House in Lakewood, and then others came from other nursing homes. And then others in time moved out.
Atlantis Community is a center for independent living, and we were the second center for independent living in the country. And our mission is to support people with disabilities, of all types of disabilities, to live in their own homes and in their own communities, and to be successful, whatever that looks like for them, and to be integrated in those communities.
When Atlantis first started, I was a volunteer attendant. I would go and do a shift, an all-night shift, and getting people up in the morning, getting them down at night, and just being there available in case there was a problem. So we were a terrific team.
As I remember going to Atlantis. I was the director of litigation for the Legal Aid Society, and my goal was to sue governments in broad ways, bring class action cases to create and affect whole groups. He wanted 100% of everything. He won everything. He never lost, he never accepted losses. In my work, the world exists in compromise, but the disability rights world didn't then. And that was its great strength.
When Atlantis started, Glenn Kopp, who was a resident of the nursing home, who also had muscular dystrophy, became later the co-director of Atlantis. That was a very exciting time. But the big area among many of the residents there was transportation. They really didn't have the social experiences, going to movies, any kind of athletic events, concerts. And so I happen to have a Volkswagen van. We had a way, I took out the back seat and I could accommodate literally 4 or 5 people in wheelchairs. We did some camping trips, we did rafting trips.
It's great if you live in your own home, but if you can't get on public transportation to then go to all of the places that everyone wants to go, how do they get there? And so fighting for accessible transportation was really the second thing that we did after moving people out of nursing facilities, which is where the Gang of 19 comes in, is making sure that people could access that transportation.
Taking advantage of the momentum of civil rights, of African American civil rights and Chicano rights and women's rights, people with disabilities began advocating for their own independence and their own sovereignty.
And I called Wade and I said, okay, how about the buses? Because Denver had just ordered 254 Roar flexible buses without wheelchair capability. So I called the director of RTD's legal, and I said, I'm going to sue you about these 254 buses, and I'm going to seek an injunction to preclude you from taking possession of those buses if they're not configured with lifts. And he said, how about you don't sue me immediately, and we'll agree that the buses will be designed to be capable of accepting lifts, so if you win a lawsuit, we can put lifts on them. I said, done.
There was always that comparison. Black people, had to sit in back of the bus, and people with disabilities couldn't get on the bus. And we talked with RTD, and they were nice, they had milk and cookies or tea, whatever. But the reality is they weren't going to do anything. And we kept pushing.
In the 1970s, bus doors were narrow with very steep stairs. People in wheelchairs simply could not ride the bus. And think about sort of the epitome of civil rights symbols, the bus. Rosa Parks made her statement of protest in a bus. And Blank and the group of activists who became known as the Gang of 19 were very aware of that symbolism, that protests around buses were catalysts for major social change.
So I called Wade and I said, I need a plaintiff. I don't have a client, I've got a lawsuit. And he said, done, because he was, in my mind, the leader. And I was the lawyer to the leader. The federal judge ruled against us, and we had proven our case. We'd proven that they were technologically feasible. We'd proven that it was easy. We could put people on the moon, as we argued, and that it would be easy to make the buses accessible. But the court felt that Congress needed to do it, not the courts. Well, Wade's reaction to that was to start holding a protest. And I don't remember exact words, but the gist was, not until the judges in the North learn like the racist judges in the South, that these people have equal rights, will we be back into the courts. And we're going to start protesting. Wade goes out in reaction, organizes the same group of refugees that he's rescued, because that's who Atlantis was.
We just had an hour-and-a-half meeting with Mr. Simpson, which basically we got a public relations rap. He was apologizing that there's only 55 wheelchairs now being transported by RTD. We pointed out to them that there are 6,000 in the Denver metropolitan area. The disabled people here are calling for the resignation of Mr. Simpson as soon as possible.
There, of course, had been disability activism around the country since the 1960s, in places like San Francisco. But the bus boycott of the Gang of 19 was a catalyst for further action and very quickly became a nationwide movement.
Wade absolutely was a visionary, but he wasn't the only one. His vision came from that Gang of 19 and the people that he moved out of the nursing home.
The Gang of 19 were mostly people with pretty severe disabilities, all utilized wheelchairs for mobility, who I think were grateful that they were able to get out of nursing homes to live independently through the efforts of Atlantis.
Carolyn Pinnell was the second named plaintiff in the Smith case after Michael Patrick Smith. And she was perhaps the most articulate disabled advocate of her period. Very intellectual, very educated, because she was very opinionated.
Linda's very articulate. Anger is, and sometimes, a motivating force, but there are people who are not angry necessarily, but they understand how others have been screwed. Linda, she's never been in a nursing home.
Larry Ruiz was all heart. He was a lovely human being with a gracious nature, treated everybody with respect. No, he was a soldier in the movement.
Grew up in a state Grand Junction Institute and managed to teach himself to read. He had tremendous speech impediment, so he used a computer. He was an amazing guy. Held the record of having the most arrests of anyone with ADAPT. I think he was arrested in different demonstrations like 75 times. Terry Fowler was everyone's delight. She and Larry were boyfriend and girlfriend. Everyone loved Terry. Very animated, sweet woman. She'd also been in a state institution, was happy to live independently.
Willie was a hero. He was a very sick guy, and I think the movement probably was useful for him to have a place to do something useful. Marianne Cisneros was always one of the happier members of the protests. She brought joy to it. She was kind of like a steady hand. She was always there. You could see her in the first or second row everywhere. George Roberts in the movement, you're going to have to kill him to stop him from protesting. He had a wonderful humor. He thought it was really fun. Mel was in his 50s then, and he was really brainy, really thoughtful, and was very useful. He was like the glue. Jeannie was a cheerleader for the movement. She was fully engaged, and she liked people, and she liked being part of everything, and she was in the middle. Lieutenant Kopp. Glenn Kopp was actually a personal friend of mine, and he lived with Wade for many years, and he was gruff and grumpy and never quite saw the roses or smelled the roses, but you kind of had to love him anyway, and he was always there. He was indispensable. He was funny, kind of a philosopher who had seen too many wars. Bob Conrad was maybe the hardest working person. He was more visionary and had insight into the movement and where it was going. He was a leader.
On July 5th and 6th, 1978, Wade Blank took their cause literally to the streets of Denver.
This group missing from all the equal opportunity promises of the American Revolution and the Constitution. I don't think it's a coincidence that the big event that puts ADAPT forward in public view takes place the day after the 4th of July.
At the corner of Colfax and Broadway, they staged a sit-in around RTD buses.
Broadway and Colfax is really the epicenter of transportation in Denver. 15 bus comes right by the Capitol, and as soon as it stops, a couple of people in chairs go right in front of the bus.
And surrounded an RTD bus with the idea of creating a spectacle of civil disobedience which would draw attention.
This bus is being controlled by the physically disabled, since they have not had control over the use of any bus in most of their lifetimes. They have a few buses, 12 of them in town, but there's no way 12 buses can handle 2,400 severely disabled young people.
What brought it about today?
Well, we just lost a court ruling where we're saying that it's obviously a constitutional right. If you're being taxed to ride a bus, you should be able to ride the bus if you so feel.
There must have been, I don't know, 75, 80 people. Most people were in wheelchairs. And so right off the bat, the police come. And it's the same thing, threatening, get off here, you'll be arrested. No one moves. No one budges.
Nobody, certainly RTD and the Denver Police Department, didn't want the spectacle of policemen handcuffing disabled people and dragging them away in front of television cameras.
Police didn't know what to do because now they had rush hour, they had a traffic jam, they had people refusing to leave.
The Gang of 19 came up with an inspiring battle cry. They chanted as they took to the streets, "We will ride."
We want to ride! We want to ride! We want to ride!
We will ride was an emotional appeal. We want what everyone else has. People were wanting desperately to ride a bus so they could go wherever they wanted to go, have the freedom that they needed to be a full citizen.
What a statement with multiple meanings for individuals. The personal mobility of being in a wheelchair, the mobility of being able to move around the city on a public bus, the symbolism of riding into the future and expanding rights.
How has RTD responded so far to this?
Well, they've fought us ever since we started. We urged them to get the first 12 buses and to look seriously at retrofitting all the buses they have. The fact of the matter is they have 200 buses now, that are accessible if they only put the lift in. They're retrofittable buses.
So the police are absolutely perplexed, and they didn't know what to do. They had never run into anything like this before.
Talk about a terrible optic. There was nothing about this that cast the police in a sympathetic light.
Inconceivable that people in wheelchairs would want to get arrested. It was a tremendous act of courage.
But Gary Delson took some nice photographs and published a story that had a photograph of them carting away the able-bodied attendants, and quoting somebody in the police department saying, "We don't want to be the fall guys here." So they refused to arrest anybody who was disabled. I don't know when in the day the geniuses finally got together and figured out that they would arrest what they perceived to be the leadership. And so they just didn't arrest them because they thought it would make their mothers mad at them. They arrested all the attendants and, turned it into a farce. How can you have a civil rights movement if you can't even get arrested for civil disobedience? And that was the plight that we saw as the protest movement began.
The protest took place over 2 days, July 5th and 6th, 1978, and it was every kind of a spectacle that Blank and the Gang of 19 wanted it to be.
As Anita Cameron, one of the activists said, it was a shot heard around the world.
Immediately following the protest, John Holland took legal action against the city for knowingly arresting the attendants rather than the actual citizens who were protesting.
That was an equal protection violation. Wade brought me 19 tickets to defend. And we went to court, and of course the city wanted to make a deal, but Wade didn't want to make a deal because we wanted what we wanted. And how are you going to have a civil rights movement if you can't even get arrested? So we went into court. We brought everybody who hadn't been arrested to his courtroom and demanded that they be allowed to attend the proceedings along with all the attendants they'd arrested. And we claimed that they'd conspired to arrest the able-bodied attendants in order not to appear as fall guys. So the argument we made was this violates the Constitution because they're selectively enforcing the criminal law, so dismiss all these charges. And he did. You wouldn't think municipal ordinance violation tickets would be significant, but they were. And they were significant symbolically, and they were significant to everyone. And people were mad that they couldn't even get arrested. So then the police had to learn to arrest people, which they got quite good at everywhere in the country.
Although the Gang of 19's action was a great success, the movement was just beginning. For the next 8 years, Wade and his fellow activists strategized, organized, and mobilized, quietly but surely moving the needle of accessibility. In 1983, along with co-founder Michael Auberger, Wade created ADAPT. Several leaders emerged along the way, including Babs Johnson, who's dubbed the mother of the organization.
ADAPT was American Disabled for Accessible Public Transportation. Nice acronym. There was a period when it was referred to as Atlantis/ADAPT. People were concerned. Atlantis had a number of grants, and ADAPT attacked the very institutions that gave them the grants. There had to be some more of a separation.
So that leads to his recognition that a nonprofit wasn't necessarily the best vehicle. So an activist group, much more of a out in the world advocating group, would be the key next stage with this. So that leads to the formation of the group ADAPT. To have its full impact, this will have to be literally go to the streets with this and go and get on the news and be very visible.
RTD fought it tooth and nail. They did not want these buses to be accessible, so as much as they fought, ADAPT fought harder.
We, of course, continued the lawsuit and ultimately won the lawsuit, and the very buses that the judge said we couldn't have made accessible are all accessible, and we quickly, through courts and protest, made Denver the most accessible city in the nation, maybe the world at that time.
Strategically, ADAPT chapters across the country began popping up, and the American Public Transportation Association, or APTA, whose members are the public transportation districts from across the country, became their prime target.
Public transit is about the common good. It's about the community well-being, and people who are planning to be oppressive and narrow don't go into that line of work, and yet they fall into their habits. This is what we do. This is the buses. These are the people who get on the buses. But it's still at its bedrock. The American Public Transit Association is about doing something on behalf of the common good and the public welfare.
Accessible to all Americans, not just able-bodied. We demonstrate at every conference or convention of the American Public Transit Association because this group in 1979 sued to have the regulation rescinded that required that all buses be lift-equipped. In 1980, APTA won that suit.
Fail to keep your wheelchair on the sidewalk, you are subject to arrest.
Wade was an excellent organizer. Sort of did some undercover kind of work of buildings, where they were going to demonstrate. He would, survey them to make sure which door to go into. People would demonstrate outside. And then someone, a non-disabled person, might open the door, and then someone with a disability would go right in, tie up the door, and then other people would go in and then take over the building. And it was very effective, and it was done very quickly. The American Public Transportation Association, they have an annual conference, and whenever they met, ADAPT would meet because they wanted every bus in the country to be accessible.
And sometimes they just do amazing things, like they shut down the American Transit Association, I think in Vegas and then again in Hawaii. They made those conventions fail and turned the focus to the movement. We want what we want. That's a great philosophy for winning a revolutionary movement.
Instead of a group of people being characterized by how other people see them, with that idea of who they are imposed from outside, that notion of taking control of self-presentation. That's a really important part of civil rights movements, to take possession of what has been a characterization imposed from outside on a group and to say, actually, this is who we are. We may have been portrayed as passive and weak and sickly, but that actually isn't who we are. That turns out to be almost as important as anything Congress does.
Parallel to the social actions and protests on the ground, legal advocates were pushing for legislative reform. APTA actions, curb cuts, sit-ins, civil disobedience across the country. ADAPT was relentless. Everything needed to be accessible. Buses, sidewalks, buildings, jobs, and the formula that worked was to protest, sue, and get as much media attention as possible.
One of our first victories was with McDonald's. So Atlantis was getting phone calls. We know what you're doing in Denver. We want to do that here. So they took that training opportunity, invited some people from Utah and from different places in the country. They came to Denver and they organized a protest at McDonald's.
People were having lunch, and then someone said, hey, wait, we can't get to the counter, it's not accessible. And so they had an impromptu demonstration, like Wade would say, all right, now let's have an action. And so it's improvised, but it was showing people that what they can do. The press came, and it became an issue.
It didn't take the McDonald's people long to realize what was going on. The CEO came to Denver, and Katie helped come up with those demands, and that we be able to use the restroom and access to the counter to order our food. So that was in the very beginning, long before the ADA. I love to tell this part of the history because, when, they knew eventually that the work would happen. McDonald's was ready to negotiate, and so when the CEO came to meet, one of the things was in their advertising to promote people with disabilities. But we always say they don't let us write the scripts, but that was part of the advocacy.
Atlantis now had 20 or 25 people in the Sun Valley Project, and all of them were more than thrilled to be plaintiffs. So we began the suit with 20 or 30 or 40 individuals who were Heritage House refugees. But we said, and they sued for damages, because once you move, you can't sue to change it, you just can sue for how they hurt you. And then all of the workers who'd been fired with Wade came in and sang very loud songs about what they'd seen and heard. And pretty soon that facility was in bankruptcy. My theory was that if no one would take the time to write Michael Patrick Smith's poetry down, then it must be because we don't care and we're not inspecting. And we claimed every nursing home resident had a right to high-quality medical, nursing, psychosocial care in a safe, sanitary, rehabilitatively supportive environment that promotes all civil rights. That was our definition of the rights violation. Of course, Heritage House evicted Michael Patrick Smith as a retaliation. So Wade and I took Michael in a bed, because he was from Denver General, to federal court, and we put him on to testify from a bed. And then we just built the case and built the case and built the case till it was millions of documents and to the Secretary of Health and Human Services and took down the national inspection system. The Michael Patrick Smith, he died on my birthday, which pissed me off permanently. So we never stopped his case till we won that and got a national inspection system.
In addition to changing the national nursing home inspection system, John Holland and his team went after the individuals who owned Heritage House, seeking damages for their refugees.
And one of the owners got up in court and said, well, we gave them candy and they had a roof over their heads. And we closed their building and made them pay. We divided it up with everybody. And it was fun because Medicaid rules were such that you couldn't have money for more than 30 days in a bank account and still be eligible, and all these people had to be eligible. But you could own a home of any value. You could have $1 million home and be on Medicaid. So we just bought 20 homes. So it was an interesting adventure with Wade.
Nothing more fascinating, really, in American history than how local grassroots movements move around, and then it goes national, and then Congress wakes up and gets going on it. So that is not an easy progression, but it's quite something.
Finally, the Americans with Disabilities Act was introduced to Congress in 1988, but quickly stagnated. Desperately and passionately fighting for their rights, ADAPT and other activists descended on Washington, D.C. on March 12, 1990, with what is now dubbed the Capitol Crawl.
ADAPT activists are very sophisticated. They're activists from way back, and they understand the optics of disability protests. So the scene of disabled people without use of their legs crawling up the national Capitol steps in support of the ADA is a powerful image that Americans are not going to watch dispassionately.
Hundreds of people got out of their chairs and tried to get up the steps to the Capitol. And that was really, really, really embarrassing. Ted Kennedy, who was a big sponsor of the bill, and George Bush first came up to the steps and told the movement leadership that if they'd call off the protests, they'd sign the bill. And so the ADA was passed to end a protest that began with the Gang of 19, basically. The ADA was a comprehensive bill, and all the bills that we'd sued on and demonstrated around and used to do legal actions were candles in a huge crescendo lighting up the world. It had to think about everything from police services to wheelchair access on airplanes to every form of government activity, and the right to be in the world expanding into services and equal treatment.
This was like a civil rights bill. Your average person on the street had no idea what ADA was and the ramifications of it. The weapon was always ADAPT, but you also had a lot of people like Justin Dart. His father was, I think, president of Kraft Foods. You had a number of players working on it simultaneously, a lot of people from Berkeley. ADAPT was always the army, so to speak, in waiting. It was indeed revolutionary.
One of the things that the ADA did for me is to outline that I was discriminated against, because what I used before that is just that gut feeling of that's not right.
It's not just for people with physical disabilities. It's all disabilities. So whether someone has an intellectual and developmental disability, a physical disability, a mental health condition, a traumatic brain injury, the ADA is really designed to provide civil rights for all people with all disabilities. Post-ADA, the requirement is that businesses have that accessibility so people can get to the grocery store, go see a movie, or get out into the community, that can get on and off of sidewalks. It's helped. It's not perfect. There's still a lot of work to be done.
Even though the ADA passed, change did not happen overnight, and ADAPT, its sister organization Atlantis Community, and other advocacy groups like Colorado Cross Disability Coalition continued to fight for a better quality of life for their community. As access to public transportation slowly resolved, ADAPT adapted and changed its acronym to American Disabled for Attendant Programs today. In 1993, ADAPT faced a huge loss. Wade Blank, just as he had predicted, died young, at age 53, swimming in Mexico with his son. His wife and daughter witnessed the event.
It was very important to him that no matter what happens, that he wanted to know that as long as we needed this sort of activism, that there is leadership that provides that opportunity. And the feedback that I get from my friends that were part of this was the absolute thing that they knew that was a must, is that the work continue to move forward, because that was so important to him. That was his main goal, is that no matter what, that our work be able to continue.
The work did and does continue, protesting with the same methods Wade developed decades earlier.
There was still problems with attendant services, and that fight has been going on now for 15, 20 years, trying to get some sort of universal policy that people with disabilities, wherever they live in the United States, get the services they need to live independently. There was a Supreme Court decision to provide services to people with disabilities in the community, but that has not really been actualized. Even though it's the law of the land, a lot of people are still winding up in nursing homes, particularly in some of the southern or poorer states in the country.
The trajectory of American history has been a path of ever-expanding rights and expanding responsibilities. As citizens, we all have certain responsibilities to give back to our communities, but we also have, as Jefferson said, inalienable rights. And when Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, the people who actually enjoyed those rights were fairly narrow. They were white men with property. But in time, we've expanded our list of who receives rights, and we've expanded our definition of what those rights are. But the rights of people with disabilities certainly include the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We're in a climate today where perhaps those rights are challenged as we talk about the cost of attending to an individual with disabilities, the cost of living independently. There's a question of who's going to pay for that. There's more and more friction, I think, over the expenses of what it takes to allow every citizen to have their rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But I hope we don't lose in the shuffle the innate humanity of people with disabilities. There was a point in our history where people with disabilities weren't even considered human. We can't go backwards. America is not a place where we take rights away from people. We expand rights. I applaud ADAPT and I applaud other groups that fight to maintain and expand those basic human rights that we all enjoy as American citizens.
Colorado's role in the disability movement is still incredibly significant, and we are still a leader. We're a leader in our Medicaid programs, we're a leader in our consumer-directed programs, we're a leader in our advocacy, we're a leader with ADAPT.
It all comes from Wade and what was happening in the 70s. Those of us that are doing the work now, we're just continuing it on, and we're working to build the Medicaid infrastructure across the country. Our main focus, and on a national level, is working on legislation to assure that people with disabilities have a choice so that we can live in our own homes instead of nursing homes, and that's for people across the country. There's stuff that we're working on right now that affects the future of long-term services and supports, and that is in our current fight against the American Health Care Act. ADAPT success is about opportunity and leadership and participation. That was core in the beginning, and it is core now, and I know that it is why we are always successful. We are, disability ran. What I've seen in the magic of the work that's done, year after year, decade after decade, is that when we say everybody can participate at whatever level they want to, that's the real success.
ADAPT, whose street credibility of being militant and the army for the movement continues to grow, chanting their mantra, "Free our people," in all of their actions. With nearly 40 chapters across the nation and a name which no longer needs an acronym, today ADAPT fights for Medicaid and DIA, the Disabilities Integration Act, which will mandate long-term services and support in the community and not in an institution, finally tackling the original issue behind the founding of Atlantis community back in 1975.
And we have a lot to lose. We are really fighting for our lives, and we're really fighting to stay in the community, and that all of these programs aren't taken away, and that's put back 40 years.
The legacy of ADAPT and the disabilities rights movement is what you see today. Whenever you get a bus, every one of those has a lift to allow people with disabilities on. You hear the stops, audibly spoken for people with vision issues. You have spaces in the bus for wheelchairs. I don't think anybody thinks that's unusual anymore. Certainly 30 or 40 years ago, it was unheard of, but today it has become an unremarkable part of our everyday lives.
I think the most important lesson that we can learn from the history and the legacy of Atlantis and the disability rights movement is that people make a difference. When people set their mind to it, they can make a difference.
But a number of those people empowered themselves in tragedies, empowered themselves in grave difficulty, and found a way to make a difference. And each one of them was seared for life by their actions. And it defines who they all are, all of them. People should make a difference. That's what Wade Blanks of the world and this group did, and they made a big difference.
At first you're hated because of what you're doing, and then after a while the next generation says, wow, you did that. People were putting their bodies, their, in some cases frail bodies, on the line, willing to be arrested, spend time in jail, be harassed, be ostracized perhaps by family, for a cause that was far, far bigger than them. That is an amazing legacy.
2018 marks the 40th anniversary of the Gang of 19's protest against the Regional Transportation District. So we've had 40 years to reflect on the achievements that have taken place since that seminal moment in Colorado's history of social justice. And groups like ADAPT have made great strides, as reflected in the Americans with Disabilities Act and other legal reforms.
So even though we've come a long way since then, there's still a lot of work to be done. There are still transportation barriers. There's still barriers to adequate health care. There's still barriers to civil rights and fair treatment and safe and affordable and accessible housing. We have a lot of work to do, and we'll continue to have a lot of work to do.
But what they did is absolutely change the country. Whether it's the McDonald's that we can all go to and order Happy Meal or whatever, or whether it's getting on the bus or whatever, that was all done by people with significant disabilities.
There is a step in every civil rights movement where it is very possible for individuals to think, this is just my problem. And then that recognition of, well, actually, there's quite a few people. And there's a community waiting to happen. This is a great case study of how much it mattered to change the minds of the people who had been categorized as frail and passive, to have them in an arena where they could change their own minds and could have a community of peers.
Everything that I've ever done good in my life has been because I have this. Just being a part, you cannot believe that you get to hang out with a group of people that literally changes lives and really gives us a quality of life, because for those of us that live it and have it, we know what that means.
We lift our voice to say that it's time to practice what we preach and live it day by day. We know that every kind of people shares the power to be free. We will live and learn and work and move and love and vote with dignity.